The crisp Charleston autumn air smelled of pine needles and expensive Tom Ford cologne. But to Elena Crawford, the evening already felt like holding her breath. She adjusted her grip on the heavy glass pie dish she was carrying, the residual warmth seeping through her coat. It was a homemade pecan pie, baked from her late grandmother's cherished recipe, a quiet offering of genuine Thanksgiving spirit meant for a night that otherwise felt entirely transactional. Beside her, Julian Sterling killed the engine of his dusty 2014 Ford F-150. The truck sat in stark, almost comedic contrast to the gleaming fleet of Mercedes and Lexuses lining the sweeping driveway of the historic colonial estate. Julian didn't seem to notice or care about the disparity. He stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his sturdy work boots, and walked around to open her door. He wore a clean but noticeably faded flannel shirt under a worn Carhartt jacket. It was the same jacket he wore when they went to Rosie's Diner on Sunday mornings, where he would quietly leave 30% cash tips for the elderly waitresses without ever making a show of it. That quiet, steadfast decency was exactly why Elena loved him. But as she looked at the towering, illuminated columns of the estate, she knew it was the exact reason her family would dismiss him entirely. "Ready?" Julian asked, his voice a low, calming rumble in the chilly night. He offered a calloused hand. Elena took a deep breath, the cold late November wind stinging her lungs. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked together up the grand brick steps. Inside, the estate was a master class in Southern aristocratic wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glittering light over heavily curated floral arrangements and silver platters of delicate hors d'oeuvres. The muted hum of old money society filled the grand foyer, a symphony of polite laughter and calculated networking. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest. At 27, as a palliative care nurse, she spent her days offering comfort to those at the end of their lives. Here, among her own blood, she felt utterly devoid of it. Before they could even reach the cloakroom, a figure detached itself from a group of elegantly dressed socialites. Beatrice Crawford, Elena's mother, glided toward them. She was in her early 60s, wrapped in a champagne-colored silk gown that matched the flawless, icy calculation in her eyes. "Elena, darling, you made it," Beatrice said, her tone perfectly pleasant but entirely empty of maternal warmth. Her sharp gaze immediately dropped to the glass dish in Elena's hands. The practiced smile on Beatrice's face froze, tightening noticeably at the corners. "And what is that?" "It's Grandma's pecan pie," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the sudden flutter in her stomach. "I thought it would be nice for Thanksgiving, a bit of family tradition." Beatrice let out a breath that was half sigh, half scoff. "Oh, bless your heart, Elena," she murmured, the classic Southern phrase deployed with lethal precision. "But we have a Michelin-starred French pastry chef handling the desserts tonight. We simply can't put that on the buffet. It would ruin the entire aesthetic of the menu." Before Elena could utter a word of protest, Beatrice elegantly snapped her fingers, summoning a passing waiter in a crisp white uniform. "Please take this to the kitchen. Leave it in the back fridge, completely out of the way," she instructed, smoothly prying the pie from Elena's hands and handing it over as if disposing of a nuisance. She then turned back to them, seamlessly producing 2 small, gold-embossed seating cards. "Now, I've put you both at table 9. It's just through the doors and to the left. You'll be very comfortable there." Elena didn't need to look at the elaborate floor plan to know exactly where table 9 was. It was the exile table, the one shoved nearest to the swinging kitchen doors, safely tucked away from the VIPs, the cameras, and the people her family actually wanted to impress. A heavy wave of humiliation washed over her. the familiar, suffocating sting of being the family's eternal disappointment. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford," Julian said politely, his rugged face perfectly unreadable. Beatrice offered a tight nod, deliberately not meeting his eyes. "Enjoy your evening." She spun on her heel, instantly returning to her wealthy friends with a bright, fabricated laugh. Elena stared at the polished marble floor, fighting the sudden, overwhelming urge to turn around and walk right back out to the truck. But before she could move, Julian gently placed a hand on the small of her back. Instead of guiding her toward the ballroom, he steered her down the narrow side corridor, following the exact path of the waiter who had taken her pie. "Julian, what are you doing?" she whispered urgently, looking around. He didn't answer until they reached the edge of the bustling catering kitchen. He gracefully intercepted the waiter, who looked thoroughly startled by the intrusion. "Excuse me," Julian said, his tone impeccably polite but carrying a quiet, undeniable authority. "Just a moment with that, please." Julian reached over to a nearby prep station, picked up a clean silver dessert fork, and smoothly cut a generous piece directly from the center of the banished pecan pie. He took a deliberate bite, chewing slowly amidst the chaotic symphony of shouting chefs and clattering copper pans. He swallowed, then looked directly into Elena's eyes, his expression completely sincere and remarkably tender. "That," Julian said softly, "is the best thing in this entire building." The tight, painful knot in Elena's chest instantly loosened, letting a breath she didn't know she was holding escape. He wasn't performing. He meant every single word. In a house overflowing with expensive illusions and polite cruelties, his kindness was the only thing that was real. He handed the fork back to the bewildered waiter, gave the young man a small nod of thanks, and turned back to Elena, his calloused fingers finding hers. As Julian took her hand and led her into the glittering, crowded ballroom, 50 pairs of judgmental eyes swept over them, but none were as cold as the gaze waiting at table 1. "Before we step into that dining room to see what happens next, I have a quick question for you. If you are still watching and finding Elena's story valuable, please leave the number 8 in the comments below just to let me know you're here with us. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend subscribing to TrueDrama Diaries and tapping that little notification bell so you never miss a moment. Your wonderful support is exactly what helps us continue creating great stories to inform, comfort, and inspire you. Thank you for being part of our family. Now let's get back to the dinner. Table 9 felt less like a seat at a Thanksgiving banquet and more like an island for the family's exiles, complete with a significantly smaller floral centerpiece, while the tables closer to the center of the grand dining room boasted towering, elaborate arrangements of white orchids and cascading autumn leaves. Table 9 was adorned with a modest, almost apologetic cluster of wilted hydrangeas. It sat precariously close to the kitchen's swinging doors, subjecting its occupants to a constant chilly draft and the muffled shouts of the culinary staff. Elena took her seat, her movements stiff and guarded. She smoothed the heavy white linen tablecloth beneath her fingers, staring at the perfectly polished silver cutlery, the ambient noise of the room, a symphony of clinking crystal wine glasses, polite murmurs, and the soft, elegant strains of a string quartet tucked into a corner alcove, felt heavy and oppressive. It was the sound of a world that had always demanded her conformity and punished her individuality. Julian sat beside her, seemingly oblivious to the glaring social demotion. He reached across the table, his calloused, weather-beaten hand coming to rest gently over hers. The rough texture of his skin against her own was a physical reminder of the hard, honest work he valued above all else. A stark contrast to the manicured, lotion-softened hands of the corporate attorneys surrounding them. It was a comforting touch, holding a quiet strength that Elena desperately needed to anchor herself in a room designed to make her feel small. It's really not that bad, Julian murmured, his lips curving into a reassuring smile. We have a great view of the exit. Elena managed a weak chuckle, but it quickly faded as a burst of laughter erupted from table 7, just a few feet away. Two men in bespoke suits, both recognizable as senior partners at her father's law firm, were leaning in close to each other. They made no real effort to lower their voices, possessing that particular brand of arrogance that assumed everyone else was simply background noise. Did you see Arthur's other daughter? One of them remarked, swirling a glass of deep red Cabernet, the one who insists on emptying bedpans for a living. I did, his companion replied, letting out a patronizing chuckle. And the farmhand she brought with her. I suppose every prominent family has its eccentricities. Arthur must be absolutely thrilled. Elena felt the heat rush to her cheeks. She shrank back slightly into her upholstered chair, the familiar, suffocating weight of embarrassment settling heavily on her shoulders. She turned to Julian, her eyes shining with unshed, frustrated tears. Julian, I am so sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the Mozart piece the quartet was currently playing. You shouldn't have to sit here and listen to this. We never should have come. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't glare at the men at table 7, nor did his posture stiffen with wounded pride. Instead, his thumb simply traced a soothing circle over the back of her hand. He looked at her with an expression of pure, unbothered calm. Listen to what? Julian asked softly, his eyes locking onto hers, completely dismissing the hostile environment around them. I'm only listening to you. By the way, you never finished telling me about Mrs. Higgins. Did she finally agree to let you read that new mystery novel to her at the clinic? Or is she still insisting she can solve the plot before Chapter 3? Elena blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by his effortless redirection. The genuine interest in his eyes pierced through the toxic atmosphere of the dining room. He wasn't pretending to ignore the insults. They simply didn't matter to him. What mattered to him was her, and the compassionate, life-affirming work she did every single day. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the tension in her jaw release. She figured out the killer in Chapter 2, Elena said, a small, real smile finally breaking through. She says the author relies entirely too much on obvious foreshadowing. Across the expansive room, at the glittering epicenter of the event, sat Table 1. Arthur Crawford was holding court. He looked entirely in his element, a glass of champagne in one hand as he leaned magnanimously toward the evening's most esteemed VIP guest, Judge Harrison. Arthur was laughing loudly at something the judge had said, patting the older man's shoulder with practiced, overly familiar enthusiasm. Arthur's posture was a deliberate performance of power and inclusion, but it also served another, crueler purpose. His back was positioned squarely and immovably toward Table 9. He was physically editing Elena and Julian out of his perfect Thanksgiving narrative. Judge Harrison, however, seemed to possess a very different kind of awareness. A man in his late 60s with silver hair and a sharp, discerning gaze, he had spent decades on the federal bench reading people and assessing the truth behind carefully constructed facades. Polite but noticeably weary of Arthur's relentless, aggressive networking, the judge offered a diplomatic nod and gently excused himself from the conversation. He turned his attention away from the epicenter of the party, letting his eyes sweep across the crowded, opulent room. His gaze passed over the tables of doctors, politicians, and socialites, drifting toward the less desirable edges of the ballroom. And then, his eyes stopped dead on Table 9. From her vantage point, Elena watched as a profound physical shock rippled across Judge Harrison's distinguished face. The polite, weary mask he had worn all evening completely vanished. He blinked hard as if doubting his own vision, before his posture snapped into rigid, startled attention. He wasn't looking at Elena. He was staring directly at the man sitting beside her in the faded flannel shirt. Before the judge could make his way across the crowded floor, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing, and the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone to command the room's attention. The silence that fell over the ballroom wasn't born of genuine respect, but of trained expectation. Arthur Crawford loved a captive audience, and tonight he had the most important one of his career. The master of ceremonies, a man in a crisp tuxedo, stepped away from the microphone, leaving Arthur standing tall behind the lucite podium positioned directly in front of table 1. As if on cue, the ambient lighting in the expansive dining room dimmed slightly, leaving a soft golden spotlight focused entirely on the patriarch of the Crawford family. Arthur straightened the lapels of his tailored Tom Ford suit jacket and raised a crystal champagne flute, his expression radiating the magnanimous, untouchable satisfaction of a man who believed he held the world, and everyone in it, firmly in the palm of his hand. "Good evening, esteemed friends, colleagues, and family," Arthur began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone, honed by 3 decades of delivering closing arguments in federal courtrooms. He let his gaze sweep over the VIPs, ensuring every eye was fixed upon him. "If you had asked me 30 years ago what I hoped to achieve in this life, I would have spoken to you about building a legacy. A true legacy isn't merely about the accumulation of wealth. It is about contributing to something greater than oneself, about intellectual excellence, and about upholding the highest, most rigorous standards of our society." It was a deeply ironic statement. As Arthur spoke passionately to the crowd about leaving a meaningful mark on the world, he remained entirely oblivious to the fact that the man sitting in the drafty, shadowy corner at table 9 was the only person in the room quietly funding a massive, statewide philanthropic empire. Arthur turned his gaze back toward his own table, his smile widening with genuine, unfiltered pride as he looked at his eldest daughter. "Victoria," he said, his voice softening into a register of deep affection that Elena rarely, if ever, heard. "From the day you graduated at the top of your class at Penn Law, to the brilliant, formidable defense attorney you are today, you have always understood the immense weight of the Crawford name. Watching you commit your future to Philip, a man who so perfectly aligns with our family's values of excellence and unyielding ambition, I have never been more proud. To Victoria and Philip, our legacy in action, our absolute pride and joy." Polite murmurs of agreement swept through the room. 50 guests raised their crystal flutes in unison. The light caught the diamonds on wrists and necks. Victoria blushed, though from Elena's vantage point near the kitchen doors, her sister's smile looked somewhat strained. Victoria's eyes darted uncomfortably toward the back of the room for a fleeting second before she looked down at her lap, choosing the safety of silence over the courage to intervene. Arthur let the polite applause settle before he continued. The warm, expansive smile remained plastered on his face, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop significantly as his eyes slowly swept past the center tables, skipping over the towering floral arrangements until they locked onto the shadows of table 9. "Of course, I must also acknowledge," Arthur said, his tempo slowing down, taking on a cadence of thinly veiled, patronizing pity, "that every family is unique, and every child must eventually choose their own path in this world." Elena stopped breathing. She stared down at her untouched porcelain plate, her fingers curling so tightly around the edge of the cheap table linen that her knuckles turned white. She knew exactly what was coming. She had braced herself for it the moment the heavy cardstock invitation arrived in her mailbox. But knowing a blow is coming and surviving the impact are 2 entirely different things. "My younger daughter, Elena," Arthur announced, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the room with his free hand, as if pointing out a minor architectural flaw in the estate. 50 pairs of eyes swiveled in their direction. "She has chosen a decidedly different route. She is a nurse, a very Respectable profession, certainly. She works hard caring for the elderly in palliative care. I am quite sure she finds it immensely fulfilling on a personal level. He paused, allowing the word respectable to hang in the crisp, air-conditioned air like a poorly wrapped consolation prize. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't using profanity or overt insults. It was a terrifying masterclass in passive aggressiveness, using perfectly polite words to inflict maximum psychological damage. He was publicly defining her grueling 12-hour shifts, her emotional labor, and her life's work of holding the hands of dying patients as nothing more than a cute hobby. To him, it was a failure to launch into the real world of measurable financial success. But Arthur wasn't finished. The spotlight demanded a punchline, and he was determined to deliver one to entertain his elite peers. And, as we can all see tonight, Elena is also in a relationship, Arthur added, his tone shifting from forced pity to a cruel, amused lilt. With a farmer, if I am not mistaken. A smattering of polite, nervous chuckles echoed from Table 7 and a few of the surrounding guests. Arthur's smirk was subtle, a tiny, triumphant lifting of the corner of his mouth that only his family would recognize for what it truly was. He looked directly at Elena, his eyes glittering with cold authority under the chandelier's light, silently challenging her to react. "Tell me, Elena," Arthur asked, his voice echoing through the silent, captivated ballroom, carrying all the weight of an 8-year-old disappointment. "Are you the app?" She dug the Arthur's. "But just before I would also, your wonderful support is exactly what helps us continue creating great stories to inform, comfort, and inspire you. Thank you so much. Now let's get the noise above, beyond Julian. He plays his amp, but before he by stopping his league. Do you know at table he a chair Victoria Sterling his the crushing he turned it and for the fest the stuff she was no Beatrice driven. We didn't. It was the you hid. He took a. We can. He didn't. There is nothing to fix, Arthur, because you broke it the moment you took that microphone, Julian said, his eyes locking onto the older man with chilling intensity. She holds the hands of people taking their last frightened breaths. She advocates for families who have absolutely no one else. She works exhausting, 12-hour shifts on her feet, and still comes home with the boundless capacity to care about the world. And you reduced all of that to a consolation prize because it didn't serve your ego. Julian paused, letting the devastating truth of his words settle over the elite crowd. That is your loss, not hers. At table 1, Victoria was weeping silently, her hands covering her face. The glittering illusion of her perfect, successful family had been entirely shattered, leaving behind nothing but the hollow, toxic reality she had been too afraid to confront. Elena looked at her sister with a fleeting pang of sympathy, hoping this catastrophic night would be the wake-up call Victoria desperately needed. Elena turned her gaze back to her parents, taking in their pale, terrified faces. "I am not angry," she said softly, realizing with a profound sense of peace that it was the absolute truth. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only clarity. "I'm just done. I am done hoping you will finally see me, and I am entirely done shrinking myself to fit into your hollow world just to make you comfortable." She didn't wait for a response, nor did she need one. Elena turned to Julian. He offered his calloused hand, and she took it, intertwining her fingers tightly with his. Together, they turned their backs on Arthur, Beatrice, and the sea of stunned, silent guests. They walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, their footsteps steady and perfectly in sync. The crowd naturally parted for them, no longer looking at them with disdain or pity, but with a mixture of profound shock and newfound, undeniable respect. As the heavy mahogany doors closed behind them, shutting out the gasps of Charleston's finest, the crisp autumn air hit Elena's face, And for the first time in her life, it tasted exactly like freedom. A week later, the lavish Thanksgiving decorations across Charleston were being carefully packed away, and the Crawford family's flawless reputation was unraveling just as quickly. The crisp, pine-scented air of the historic district had been left behind, replaced by the comforting, honest aroma of roasted coffee beans, sizzling bacon, and maple syrup inside Rosie's diner. Elena sat in a worn red vinyl booth, tucked into the quietest back corner of the restaurant, her hands wrapped tightly around a thick ceramic mug. Across the scuffed Formica table sat Victoria, looking remarkably out of place in her tailored designer trench coat against the diner's faded, checkered linoleum floor. The older sister's usually immaculate makeup was entirely absent this morning, revealing dark, exhausted circles beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and shattered illusions. "Philip postponed the wedding," Victoria said softly, her voice carrying a brittle, fragile edge that barely rose above the comforting hum of the diner's morning rush. She stared down at her untouched, pitch-black coffee as if it held the answers she was desperately looking for. His family, Judge Harrison specifically, made it very clear that they cannot formally align themselves with a family that lacks basic human decency. Philip told me he needed time to reevaluate our shared values, to see if we actually share any values at all. Elena didn't offer a hollow platitude or a quick reassurance. She simply reached across the table, placing her hand gently over her sister's trembling fingers, offering a silent, steadying presence. Victoria let out a long, shaky breath, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her pale cheek. "That isn't even the worst of it, Elena. Dad lost the Miller and the Hayes accounts on Monday morning. Two of his biggest corporate clients pulled their retainers, citing concerns over character and public judgment in their official emails. Mom hasn't left the house in 5 days. She was discreetly asked to step down from the country club's holiday planning committee. They said she needed time to focus on her family. People are talking. Everywhere we go, the whispers are deafening." "I'm sorry, Victoria," Elena said gently. And she truly meant it. Despite everything, she didn't revel in their sudden, catastrophic downfall. She only ever wanted them to understand the pain they caused, not to be destroyed by it. "Don't be," Victoria whispered, finally looking up, her eyes filled with a profound, aching regret. "I should have stood up for you. At the dinner when Dad raised that glass, and every single day for the past 8 years. I sat there and let them treat you like you were invisible, like you were somehow less than us, because it was easier than fighting them. I spent my entire life being their perfect puppet, performing for their approval, sacrificing my own happiness to maintain their pristine image. And now I don't even know who I actually am without them pulling the strings." "You're my sister," Elena said, her voice firm, anchoring Victoria in the stormy, unpredictable aftermath of their family's collapse. "And for the first time in your life, you finally have the chance to figure the rest out for yourself. You don't have to be Arthur Crawford's perfect legacy anymore. You can just be Victoria." Victoria nodded slowly, wiping her face with a cheap, coarse paper napkin, a stark contrast to the linen she was used to. "They want to see you. They called me 3 times this morning, begging me to ask you on their behalf. They want a chance to apologize, to fix it all before it gets worse." Elena took a slow sip of her coffee, the familiar, bitter warmth spreading steadily through her chest. "They already called me too," she revealed, her tone completely even. "Last night. They sounded terrified, stripped of all that arrogant certainty. I told them that if they truly want to fix this, it won't happen with a quick PR-friendly apology designed to save their social reputation. I told them I would agree to 8 weeks of mandatory, intensive family therapy." Victoria's eyes widened in genuine surprise, her breath catching in her throat. "Did they agree to do it?" They didn't have a choice, Elena replied calmly. But I made my terms absolutely clear. For the first entire session, they are not allowed to speak a single word. They are going to sit in that small room and listen to 27 years of how their actions made me feel. No interruptions, no courtroom defenses, no gaslighting excuses. If they can't do that, if they can't sit with the discomfort of their own cruelty, then I am walking away for good, and I won't look back. I'll be there, Victoria said instantly, a newfound resilient resolve hardening her tear-stained features. I need to go too. I need to hear it, and I need to tell them how they broke me too. Elena smiled, a genuine, luminous expression of hope breaking through the heavy conversation. I'd really like that, Vic. A few booths down, Julian was standing comfortably at the counter, chatting amiably with Rosie, the diner's elderly owner. He wore the same faded Carhartt jacket, looking completely at ease as he laughed at a joke she made, seamlessly slipping a generous cash tip under his empty coffee cup. He didn't look like a billionaire philanthropist who controlled an empire, nor did he want to be treated like one. He just looked like a good, decent man who respected the hard work of others. Watching him, Elena felt a profound, grounding sense of peace settle over her heart. She had spent so much of her life agonizing over her parents' approval, starving for a validation they were emotionally incapable of giving. But the devastating events of Thanksgiving hadn't just exposed her family's hollow superficiality. They had brilliantly illuminated the quiet, unshakable beauty of her own life. She had built a world of deep compassion, of quiet healing, and of genuine, unconditional connection. Julian caught her eye from across the busy diner, his rugged face breaking into a warm, familiar smile that felt like coming home. He walked over, sliding into the booth next to her, his solid presence a comforting, familiar weight against her side. True wealth, she realized as Julian reached for her hand across the worn diner table, wasn't measured by a title or a bank account, but by the warmth of a hand held in the dark. When we strip away the heavy armor of judgment, we finally open the door to genuine compassion. True wealth is never found in the title printed on a business card or the balance of a bank account. It resides in the quiet, steady moments of showing up for someone when they need it most. Perhaps a simple, unconditional smile offered today can kindle a warm, resilient heart tomorrow. Let us remember to measure a person's worth, not by the shine of their shoes, but by the depth of their character. As I reflect on Elena and Julian's journey, I am reminded of how easily we can get caught up in the superficial race of life, entirely forgetting the beautiful souls who quietly hold our world together. Elena's courage to walk away from a toxic legacy, to protect her own peace, is a powerful testament. It proves that it is never too late to redefine what family, love, and true success actually mean to us. Have you ever felt misunderstood or undervalued by the people who should know you best? How did you find the strength to walk your own path? I would truly love to read your experiences and reflections in the comments below. Let's build a community of kindness together. If you found a piece of your own heart in tonight's story, please consider subscribing to TrueDrama Diaries. Join our family as we continue to share tales that celebrate the quiet triumphs of the human spirit. Until next time, hold your loved ones close, take care of yourselves, and remember, the best things in life are the ones we give away.